Jesus said in Matthew 23, verse 9, call no man father upon the earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven.
Okay, Matthew 23, verse 9. So this is another example of a Protestant that they'll quote one verse, but then they don't look at all of these surrounding verses. Let's go to Matthew 23 really quick. Okay, so we're in Matthew 23, and he quoted verse 9, because verse 9 says, call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. That's verse 9, right? But they always leave out verse 8 and verse 10, because verse 8 says this, and I don't know how they could have missed, verses 8 and 10, because 9 is right in between 8 and 10. So if they read, verse 9, they had to have read verse 8 if they're reading chronologically, and I'm sure that they wouldn't have stopped at verse 9. They'd probably go on to the next verse. Here's what it says. Matthew 23, verse 8 says, you are not to be called rabbi or teacher, for you have one teacher, and you are all brethren. Right? So you can't call anybody teacher. Don't call anybody teacher. In verse 10, it says, neither be called masters, for you have one master, the Christ. So in Matthew 23, it's not just prohibition against calling somebody father. You also can't call him teacher, and you can't call him master. So not teacher, not father, not master. Well, what's interesting is that when you actually read the New Testament, which is something this guy should try doing sometime, because he obviously never has, the New Testament is actually flooded with instances of the apostles referring to people and even referring to themselves as, you guessed it, teachers, masters, and even fathers as well. So for example, in the book of Acts, if you go to Acts chapter 7, the very first martyr, Saint Stephen, the deacon, he refers to Abraham as his father and as the father of Christians. Yeah, he calls Abraham father, but wait a second. The Bible says, call no man father. So why is Saint Stephen, who was the very first martyr in the church, why did he call Abraham father right before he was martyred? Does that mean that Saint Stephen is damned to hell because he called Abraham father? And it's not just Saint Stephen. Did you know that the Apostle Paul also calls Abraham father in the book of Romans? If you go to Romans chapter 4, verses 1 through 18, did you know that he calls Abraham father like a bunch of times? Like, I think it was something like 16 times that he calls Abraham father. Did you know that? So here's Paul the Apostle, St. Paul the Apostle, calling another man besides Jesus Christ, Father. Another man besides God the Father, Father. Did you know that the book of James also calls Abraham Father in James 2:21? Did you know that the Apostle Paul also calls himself a father and refers to other men as father in 1 Corinthians 4? If you go to 1 Corinthians 4, read verses 14 through 17, Paul calls himself a father of many children. And he's not talking about biological children, he's talking about spiritual children, he's talking about Christians. Did you know that Paul also refers to himself as a master and refers to other people as masters? So in Matthew 23:10, it says, call no man master. But then what is St. Paul doing in Ephesians chapter 6:5? Because in Ephesians chapter 6:5, St. Paul says this. He says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your earthly masters. Masters. Be obedient to those who are your earthly masters with fear and trembling in singleness of heart as to Christ. Oh my goodness. Why did St. Paul the Apostle just say that? Did St. Paul the Apostle never read Matthew 23 verse 10? Not only did he just tell slaves to be obedient to their masters, he says be obedient to your earthly masters as to Christ. So he even went extra far. He took the extra step. He said, you obey these earthly guys in the same way that you obey Christ? Really? Oh my goodness, St. Paul must have never read Matthew 23 verse 10. Or Matthew 23 verse 9, because he calls himself father and he refers to other people as father all the time. And this isn't even the only time in Ephesians 6:5. This isn't even the only time where Paul referred to other masters besides God. He does it again in Colossians. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 1, Paul says this. Paul says, masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Oh my goodness, Paul, you did it again. You referred to other men as masters, even though Matthew 23:10 says, call no man master, for there's only one master. So Jesus in Matthew 23 says that there's only one master, but now Paul is referring to a whole bunch of masters. Everyone who had a slave back then was a master. And the slaves had to obey them as they obeyed Christ. Oh, this poor Paul fellow, he obviously never read the Bible, and neither did this guy that I'm responding to. But Paul, not only did he call other people masters, he also was calling a bunch of people his children. He was calling himself the father of many children. He did it all the time. He did it in Philippians 2:22. He did it in 1 Thessalonians 2:11. He did it in Titus 1:4. Oh, and then in Titus 2:9, he once again calls somebody else master. In Titus 2:9, he says, "Bid slaves to be submissive to their masters and to give satisfaction in every respect. They are not to talk back." Wow. Wow, again, all over his writings, Paul is over here referring to other masters who are not God, and then calling himself Father, right? In Philemon 1:10, he does it again. In Hebrews 12:9, we don't know if Paul wrote that, but Hebrews 12:9 refers to other fathers. And then the Apostle John too. You know that in 1 John chapter 2, verses 13 to 14, he refers to other father. And in 3 John 1:4, he talks about his children. If they're his children, that means he's their father. So we have all of these New Testament figures, even apostles, the Apostle Paul, the Apostle John, Saint Stephen, the deacon who was the first martyr. They were all calling people father. Saint Paul was even calling other people masters. Oh my goodness, I can't believe it. Obviously, the apostles Paul and John didn't know the Bible as well as this guy over here.